Hi, welcome to chapter 25, the Baroque in Northern Europe. So we've been looking at the art of the Baroque in primarily Italy, the art of the Counter-reformation, looking at Catholicism's response to Martin Luther and the Protestants. We've been looking at some of the great artists of that era, the Roman artist Bernini and Caravaggio, looking at the Spanish artist Velázquez, as well as some others, but primarily focusing on those three. So now we're going to be moving out of Italy and Spain, and we're going to be looking at what we call the Northern Baroque. We're going to be looking at primarily Flanders. Here we're going to be looking at the Netherlands, or sometimes you might want to call it Holland. We're going to be looking a little bit in France and England today, but primarily we're going to be focusing on Flanders and the Netherlands. We're going to be, as you can see by this map, we're starting to see a Europe that looks a lot more modern. We're starting to see these modern nation states start to coalesce. We've already talked about the incredible power and wealth that was being acquired by some of these European nations because of expansion and colonization and, in many cases, exploitation. But there is now access to natural resources in a way that had never been possible before. And so many of these states, many of these nations are becoming incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful, and the monarchs who rule them are becoming just as wealthy and just as powerful. So we are once again in a time of absolute monarchy, where many of the monarchs of Europe sort of ruled with an iron fist. Although we're going to see in the Netherlands things are going to be very different there, and they have a very different way of ruling themselves and a very different sort of culture and outlook. But we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, so let's just keep going. So, Baroque art in Northern Europe. We're going to first talk about Peter Paul Rubens. He was a born Protestant but raised Catholic after his father died. He was raised in Antwerp. This guy is sort of one of the big superstar artists of his day. In many ways, Rubens is sort of the culmination of many of the concepts of fame and celebrity that began in the Renaissance, whereas many of those artists, as you know, especially, when we look at Leonardo or Raphael or Michelangelo, had achieved an incredible status with international recognition. Rubens even upped that game even more, because this guy wasn't just incredibly celebrated and known. He was also incredibly wealthy, but he also had a lot of political power. He's going to serve as a counsel and an advisor to some of the great monarchs of the era. He is going to function as a diplomat for various monarchs throughout his lifetime. So this is a guy who held a lot of political and social clout, as well as being sort of celebrated as an artist. And he achieved a level of fame and power that no artist had really ever achieved before. He was the court painter of the Duke of Mantua. Eventually he goes to Madrid and Rome as the Duke's emissary. There he is exposed to the art of Caravaggio, which is going to be a big influence. In fact, he convinced the Duke of Mantua to buy Caravaggio's Death of the Virgin, which we already talked about. He was a friend of Philip IV of Spain. He was the court painter of Charles I of England and Marie de Medici of France. Oh, the Medici, there they are again. In the early 1600s, he studied in Italy, as I said. But he traveled on a lot of diplomatic missions for the Gonzaga family. In 1609, he was the court artist for the Archduke of Austria. So this guy got around and he rubbed elbows with the richest and most powerful rulers and leaders in Europe at the time. And he was an artist. All right, so this is sort of the Renaissance dream come true. This is one of Rubens' better-known works. This is a guy who painted hundreds and hundreds of works. He had a massive workshop that we're employing dozens and dozens of apprentices and laborers. So he would produce these massive commissions, these huge artworks that he's not painting all by himself, but instead he's serving more as kind of a director, where he's, has his trained apprentices who have learned to paint in his style, creating these works, and then he would come in and sort of paint the most important parts, the faces and the figures in the front and things like that. So, think of it very much like a modern-day movie director, kind of telling people what to do and where things go. This is the elevation of the cross. This is a triptych, meaning it is, it's Triptych, sorry about that. Triptych simply means there's three parts. This is very common to altar pieces that open up like that. This, as you can see, is an image of the elevation or the raising of the cross. We're going to focus primarily on the central panel. You can see we have a rather interesting image. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I think 9 figures lifting lifting the cross with Christ attached. It's meant to show the weight of Christ's sacrifice, the weight of sin, and just emphasize the importance of this moment. Once again, you can tell we're in the Baroque because of drama and dynamism. Everything is moving, everything's in motion. The weight of that cross is evident in the straining muscles of the figures who are trying to lift it. We're also looking at something, the importance of Michelangelo here. With these muscular bodies. Michelangelo, all the great Renaissance artists cast a huge shadow over art they will for the next hundreds of years. And at this time, we are, still less than 100 years away from, Michelangelo's prime, and his influence is still incredibly powerful. And so these massive muscular figures are very much influenced by Michelangelo. Of course, we also have a Caravaggio influence here, with this tenebristic lighting, with the dramatic sort of emotional poses. This is all very Caravaggio. But unlike Caravaggio, these figures aren't normal, everyday looking people, but instead they are powerful, strong men in much more of a Renaissance style than the style of Caravaggio. Rubens was one of the great art collectors of his day, not just of his contemporary artists and the artists of the Renaissance, but of classical. He also helped monarchs and other people he worked for acquire their collections. This is one of 5 paintings made about the senses. It's starring sort of in the center here, Cupid and Venus, looking at an image of Christ healing the blind. So this is at the allegory of sight. He actually painted this with another artist, Jan Bruegel the Elder. But this is meant to demonstrate not only the fact that we see with our eyes, and this is how we perceive the world, but also it refers to spiritual vision, spiritual sight, being awoken to sort of the truth of God. So, we have this image of literally sort of the blind learning to see in the middle. Now, we have a little syncretism going on here, don't we? We have Cupid and Venus looking at a Christian scene. I mean, this is very much a post-Renaissance world where in art very often you see these two subject matters sort of intertwining and combining, and that is certainly the case here. This is an image of a real collection of the Habsburg Archduke and Archduchess that Rubens worked for and helped assemble this collection for. These rooms were also often called, or were called, Kunstkammern, which literally means art cabinet, but you would sort of pile all of your art and all of your various items into this sort of one room, and then you could invite guests over and show off your magnificent collection. Okay. The arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille. This is one of 24 images that depict the life and career of Marie de Medici, who was the widow of Henry IV of France, and at the time was serving as regent, and was in a fight with her son for power and control. And so in many ways this is a political, not in many ways, in every way, these paintings were a political statement to sort of prop up the power of this Medici ruler. You can't get away from, can you? So I find this image fascinating. Now remember, this is one of 24, and this is in itself a 12-foot painting. So, these would have hung in the palace. And we see Marie Medici, the Medici, arriving as a young bride, virginal and pure, and destined to rule. She arrives on this ship, representing also kind of the ship of state, being trumpeted, being heralded at the top by, I can't get it to work, guys. Oh, hey, there goes everything. Only the best at Collin College. Okay, so we see this Nike figure, this symbol of victory, trumpeting her arrival. The sea itself has ensured her safe passage, as we see Neptune and his daughters escorting sort of Marie de Medici's ship to France. These figures, you'll often hear the term Rubenesque to describe sort of especially a woman's body that is sort of fleshy and sort of rounded kinds of curves. I don't want to get too weird or creepy sounding here, but this is just often a term used to describe, and it comes from Rubens' sort of taste in depicting these kinds of women's bodies. As you see down here in these sea nymphs, these daughters of Venus. Up here on land, we have the bride, Marie, and she is being greeted by a personification of France. Personification is when you take an abstract concept, like an idea or a state or something, and you turn it into a person, like Lady Liberty, right? Father Time. These are personifications of concepts. So here we have France greeting her. And I love the way she just appears sort of almost trance-like, as if this is all beyond her control, but instead she is destined to be here and to be this bride of this king and to become the ruler of France. This is all very much political propaganda. Not much to say about this. This is Peter Paul Rubens' Garden of Love, sort of classical references here, but also a bit of a family portrait with him and his wife. And in many cases, Rubens is kind of the anti-Caravaggio. They're two of the biggest influential painters of the Baroque period, and they both had very different career paths. One ended up literally a fugitive from the law and dying in exile, and the other one becomes one of the most powerful and influential not just artists but political figures of his day, who accumulated a lot of wealth, but also who had from everything we know, a very happy family life and lots of kids, and was very sort of successful in this very kind of traditional sort of way. He loved allegories. He loved messages. He loved the influence that he had over some of the big rulers of the day. For example, Ferdinando II, who was the Duke of Tuscany, and also a Medici. He tried to gain influence with the 30 Years' War by painting this image of called The Consequences of War, where we see Venus and Mars in the center. And one of the reasons we know so much about what Rubens' paintings mean is that he wrote all this stuff down. He was very verbose and eloquent in his writings, and so we know a lot of his intentions because he wrote them down. We don't have to do a lot of guesswork, and so his allegories are really well described. So here we see Rubens, we see Venus and we see Mars, love and war. And this is the effect of war. We see this sort of image of pestilence here, bringing disease. We see people trampled underfoot and dying. We see children being massacred. But most importantly for Rubens, we see art and literature and architecture and productivity and business and the sort of the things that make the world suffering as a consequence of war. Open doors on the Temple of Janus on the left. This come from Roman history, symbolizing that war has begun. But this is really meant to show the devastating effects of war, not just on people, but on the arts and on the fact that our culture is often lost in wartime. The thing that kind of defines us and who we are is destroyed by war. And you know, the 1600s are an incredibly violent century. A lot of this has to do with the breakup of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation and sort of the rise of some of these powerful Protestant states that conflicted with with Catholic control. Plus just normal everyday nations vying for power, led to an incredibly violent time in history, and Rubens wanted to try to assert some of his influence over some of these monarchs, and he tried to do that through what he knew best, his art. Anthony van Dyck is an English artist, trained under Rubens. He brought a lot of Rubens' style into his own work. He painted for Charles I, the King of England, and here we see a typical image of absolute monarchy. We see Charles I standing in front of a landscape, so showing his dominion and power over the land, and we see a horse bowing. So even nature realizes the divine right. It's really sort of ridiculous, isn't it? The sort of divine right of the king and his right to rule. All right, let's look at the Dutch. The Netherlands. Holland. Call it what you want. A tiny country with a huge influence. Holland is a province of what is known as the Netherlands, and so we often call it Holland as naming the entire country. But also we can call it the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic had recently won towards the end, towards the beginning of the 1600s. I can't talk. Independence from Spain, and this led to the Dutch forming a republic. So we are not looking at a monarchy here. We are looking at a country with elected leaders, representatives, representing the wishes of their constituents. At least in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. So, what is? Let me move this down a little bit here. So what we're not going to see is art made for kings, right? And we're looking at a Protestant country, so we're not going to see art made for the Catholic Church. In fact, many Protestant countries at this time, for them, images were anathema. They weren't allowed because people would be prone to idol worship. So in a lot of these early Protestant churches, they would have been whitewashed and not had any images or very, very few images. Now, of course, an art market did exist, but it existed outside of the church and really the state for the most part. So what we're going to see are private individuals and businesses buying art in the Netherlands. And this is also a capitalist economy. This was a culture that had one of the first stock markets in Europe. This was a culture that was becoming one of the great world powers through trade, and you might have heard of the famous Dutch East India Company, which had trade routes established throughout Africa and Asia. This is a country that was setting up colonies in North America. I mean, New York was once New Amsterdam. It was the a lot of the East Coast was initially settled, or New England was initially settled by the Dutch. So, what kind of art did these people produce? Well, the Dutch were a very hardworking people. You sometimes hear the term the Protestant work ethic. And so what we get is something kind of strange. We get a culture that is basically a capitalist society, but also a very Christian, Calvinist, Protestant society. So there's a certain humility to their art and their culture. There's a belief that you didn't show off your wealth. You didn't live ostentatiously. You didn't wear sort of lots of jewelry and things like that and draw attention to yourself. But at the same time, hard work was a sign of godliness. And what is evidence of your hard work? Success, right? That is the reward for hard work. So there's a weird thing in Dutch art where it's like, okay, we want to show off that we're working hard, but we don't want to be too flashy about it. So you're going to see sort of strange images of people showing off their goods, showing off their nice clothes, showing off their good lifestyles, but they're trying to be as humble about it as possible. Okay, let's jump in. All right, so this is a kind of a typical Dutch portrait. It's by Gerrit van Honthorst. It is called The Supper Party. And in many ways, I say it's typical because Dutch art is often secular in subject matter. Now, there's certainly a lot of religious images made, maybe made for the home, not for churches. But a lot of Dutch art is just everyday stuff, what we call genre painting, G-E-N-R-E. And by genre painting, we mean people living everyday lives, going to work, going to parties, that kind of stuff. And this is exactly what we see here in this painting. Now, if you are seeing a Caravaggio influence, congratulations. This is very Caravaggio-esque in its composition and its use of tenebrism and its use of sort of everyday folk in its artwork. But let's move on to one of the biggies, Franz Halls. Franz Halls, not the inventor of the cough drop. Franz Halls is one of the great portrait painters, and he painted a lot of group portraits. These were very common in the Dutch Republic. Belonging to sort of public organizations was very much a part of Dutch society and really seen as a sort of like a social obligation. And these, what I mean by social organizations, are everything from like sort of fraternities and sororities, kind of social organizations, things like business organizations, chambers of commerce, those kinds of things. Modern day equivalents would be like Lions clubs and Elks clubs, things like that. Military militia organizations were a big part of Dutch life. Sports teams, charitable organizations, things like orphanages and homes for elderly people. Those kinds of things were a big part of life in the Netherlands, and they wanted to commission portraits. Here is a portrait by Franz Halls. This is of the Archers of St. Hadrian. This was a militia group shown here holding their weaponry. Now, Dutch independence had recently been won from Spain, so these militia groups were often very, very proud of their accomplishments. In many ways, this is a typical portrait in that we have sort of everybody in the group lined up in one line. But where it differs is that we're not simply just seeing a person sitting there posing, but instead, and this is very key to Dutch art, there's a need and a desire to show sort of an inner life of the person being who is posing. Yeah, there's a desire by these Dutch artists to really capture their individuality and their personality, and I think you can see that in the various expressions of the men and their body language and the way they're interacting with each other. This feels very alive in a way that a lot of portraits do not feel alive, and that's very typical of Dutch art. This is one of my favorites. This is the women regents of the Old Men's Home at Haarlem. This is a group of women who run a home for old men who can't take care of themselves and who are too poor to live on their own. And what I love is how Halls has really captured the personality and expressions of these women. Although they are in a much more conservative stance than the archers that we saw earlier, all sitting very sort of demurely, these old ladies. If you look at their expressions, I think you get an idea of their personalities, from the very sort of strict to the very kindly to, well, maybe the little bit slightly senile. Who knows? But there's a real desire by Halls to capture what's going on. Look at the clothing of these women. It is equal parts reserved and modest and extravagant. If you look at the clothing, it's made of really, really nice, beautiful material. This is not cheap stuff. And yet, though, it is clothing that is designed to conceal the body for modesty's sake. It is designed to also represent the modesty of one's wealth. You don't want to be too extravagant in what you show. This is a very religious, a very conservative Protestant society. And yet at the same time, we get images of fun, of debauchery, of drinking, of partying, of good times, because that's the real world. And there's a realness to Dutch art, right? This is what I love about it. There's a realness here that you don't see in the art necessarily of Italy and Spain. Now, there's a realism in the emotion of Caravaggio, but it's kind of almost like soap opera emotion, isn't it? These dramatic figures posing. But in the Netherlands, it's a lot more real. Like, you're looking at snapshots or somebody's, Insta post or something. And this is one of my favorites. This is a portrait of a woman named Malbabe, who was a drunkard, who was a woman who often was seen at local taverns and was probably mentally ill. In fact, Franz Halls had a son who was in a sanatorium, and this in many ways is probably a representation of what his son was going through, of the mental disorders, whatever he suffered from. The owl is often we kind of more associate with wisdom these days, but it was often associated with foolishness, with drunkenness, in this culture. And so this owl perched on the shoulder is meant to show the sort of unstable state of mind of this drunken woman. And of course, the sad reality is that she's probably in a way self-medicating, as a lot of people who are homeless do, because they have mental problems. They don't have access to medications they need, and they often medicate themselves through substance abuse. So we're actually seeing something very kind of true to life, and what initially comes off maybe as sort of silly and funny, this sort of clownish looking figure, there are sort of layers of sympathy and empathy here that Halls is painting with, because he would have understood. He would have understood because he had a son who had mental problems too. Judith Leister. A lot of times, for over the years, a lot of her work was mistaken for Franz Halls because it was passed off. In fact, being a woman artist, it was very difficult sometimes for her work to sell. And so there are cases where her name has been covered up and Franz Halls' name was added on top of it. And this is sometimes centuries later. So it really wasn't until 1893 that we realized that this painting and a lot of her other works were painted by Judith Leister. She's not from an art family, so she's more or less self-taught. She was only the second woman to be allowed into the Harlem Guild of St. Luke's. Okay, so let's talk about this really quickly. So we've talked about the problems that women artists had. There were women artists, but it was very difficult to be one. In the Netherlands, it was a little bit easier. And also in Flanders, in the Flemish world, it's a little bit easier because of the fact that we're not looking at Catholic countries, or we're looking at countries that had mixed populations, and the sort of strict rules of also of a monarchy weren't in place. And so these are market-driven economies. So that means that if people could sell their work, whether they be male or female, and people bought them, then they could make a living. It was still much more difficult for women artists. In fact, we're seeing an image very similar to what we saw with Artemisia Gentileschi's self-portrait. A woman painting herself painting as a way of demonstrating her ability and her skills as an artist. Well, let me show you my favorite Judith Leister. This may or may not be a self-portrait. This is another image that was falsely attributed to Franz Halls. It's called Carousing Couple, and it is a hoot. It is a hilarious painting to me. Because this is, I call it Dutch Girls Gone Wild. But we have here a couple who are out partying, having fun. And you can see that there are several drinks into the evening, and the man is playing this fiddle, and he is not being very precise about it because he's probably a few drinks too many to be precise. And then we see the woman over here pouring yet another drink and giving this man the eye. This is a tender swipe if I ever saw it, right? I love this painting because, you know, it could be read. A lot of these Dutch paintings were meant to teach a moral lesson. You know, you don't go out drinking. Don't end up, you know, succumbing to your more base kinds of feelings. And yet at the same time, they're sort of acknowledging, yeah, this stuff happens. This is the way people are. There's a realness here that I just absolutely love and adore, and there's a sense of fun and playfulness that you would never see this in Italy or Spain. This kind of mocking of human nature, and this is very much a continuation of what we talked about in the art of Northern Europe, and how there's this real sense of realness of everyday life in these in that art. Rembrandt, the great artist of the Dutch Baroque, one of the great artists of the Baroque period. He's up there with Caravaggio in terms of influence, in terms of importance. And he's a man who painted really unlike anybody else at the day. Yeah, you can look at him and say, all right, yeah, obviously influenced by Caravaggio. You can see influenced by Franz Halls. But there's an experimentation in Rembrandt's work that we'll see, a quest for always trying new things. There's also an interest in the psychology of human behavior that is evident in a lot of Dutch art. But Rembrandt takes to sort of a whole new degree. Before I talk about Rembrandt's life, let's look at this very famous painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp. So we see a group of students gathered around a corpse, and we see the good doctor, Dr. Tulp, a very well-respected physician, an instructor, giving an anatomy lesson in a very gruesome, realistic sort of way. So in the same kind of realism that we see people in bars drinking, or we see the personalities of the old ladies of a nursing home, we also see that in the veracity, the truthfulness of what a body being dissected looks like. We're giving the truths of surgery here, or in this case, dissection. Look at the way Rembrandt has arranged the figures. This is very different than Franz Halls. They're not lined up in a straight line, sort of like a soccer picture style, but instead they're grouped in this primarily a sort of a pyramidal sort of formation. Thank you, Leonardo da Vinci. That way we can see all of their faces and, most importantly, all their personalities and the way they're reacting to this lesson in different ways, some of them with intrigue, some of them being distracted, etc., etc. This, of course, arrangement would have been is unrealistic in the sense that, you know, normally these students probably would have been all gathered around in a circle around the corpse, the cadaver, but that would make a terrible picture. So we don't see this. But what we are seeing is a huge transition, a change in Dutch portraiture. And Rembrandt is bringing in a realism, he's bringing in a personality to this work that we had not really seen before. So let's talk about him. He was born in Leiden in the Dutch Republic to a well-to-do family. His father was Protestant, not Protestant, I don't know what that is, Protestant, and his mother was Catholic. Pardon me, I hope nobody is. Okay. He goes to Amsterdam. He's opens a studio eventually, and he moves to Amsterdam to become a portrait painter. He marries a woman of some means, a woman named Saskia, and she has 3 children before she dies. He had one son that survived. She dies from tuberculosis. And then eventually he falls in love again with a nurse, but then she sues him because he doesn't marry her, and then he falls in love with somebody else, but never marries her. He does this partially because his son would not have received his dead wife, Saskia, inheritance. But ultimately, Rembrandt dies poor and almost forgotten. And at one point, he was the leading artist in Amsterdam. He was one of the most successful artists in Europe. And this is a man whose fortunes and whose career is like a roller coaster, both professionally and personally. He experiences incredible heights in fame and success and wealth, and incredible lows of the loss of children and wives, legal problems. He was also a man who suffered from alcoholism, and a lot of Rembrandt's problems are self-made. He was poor. He made poor financial decisions. He was terrible with money. He spent way more than he had. He lived like a rock star, and this, he bought houses he couldn't really afford to live in, and this also led ultimately to his financial downfall. And yet, he remains one of the great painters. He remains one of the most important painters, because he brings with him an insight into human nature, and the way he was able to paint human characteristics was unlike anybody before. This is a painting called, I'm moving myself over here, called The Night Watch, although it's actually called The Company of Captain Franz Koch. But we call it The Night Watch because it's a group of soldiers out performing their sort of rounds outside the city gates, but not at night. Actually, this was meant to be an early morning scene, but this hung in a hall near a fireplace for many years, and the soot from the fireplace darkened the image. So, we are looking at a group portrait. Each man paid about 100 guilders, although those who paid more are up front, those who paid less are in the back. We see Rembrandt, as he did in the Dr. Tulp anatomy lesson, we see him grouping figures into smaller subgroups here to emphasize the relationships that these men had with each other, as well as their individual personalities through their various facial expressions and body language. We see here a figure shooting or loading a rifle, which was meant to show his readiness as a soldier. And of course, these men had recently won independence from Spain, and so there's a sense of pride here. Look at what the men are wearing. These are soldiers on active duty, and yet they're dressed like they're going to go out clubbing because it's picture day, guys. And Rembrandt here has captured them in all their sort of vain glory in a way. These men wearing, and especially the lieutenant up here in the front, this ridiculous outfit with this big white plume. You would not go fighting in this, but instead, this man is sort of showing off his position and his wealth. And I love the way the captain is dramatically posing here. He's removed a glove as he's directing his men with his bare hand, wearing his sash, showing us his position. But if you look at everybody throughout this painting, you'll see individual behaviors emphasized, from the old man who just wants to shoot somebody to the guy in the background who shows up maybe a little bit hungover or possibly still drunk. And yet, in all of this realism and this veracity of human behavior, the way he's grouped these people into subgroups and really paid attention to their actions, we have this odd figure of this little girl who is glowing. She is probably a mascot figure. She might be based on a daughter or somebody related to one of these men. But ultimately, she serves kind of a guardian angel, as a mascot. And if you look closely, you'll notice she has a chicken tied around her waist. This is meant to represent this group, the Cloveneers, and they associated themselves with the chicken. It was sort of their symbol because they referred to their barracks as the chicken coop. It also might have something to do with the captain's name, which was Cock. What we're seeing here is an image that is not just a picture of a group of men, but of individuals reacting and relating to each other. When I say Rembrandt's the great psychological painter, this to me is an incredible example of that. He's interested in human behavior in a way that nobody else really was before. One of Rembrandt's favorite stories was The Return of the Prodigal Son. This is a story that he depicted several times. The image on the right is later on in his career, and it is an image that is set at toward the end of the story. The image on the left, though, is my favorite. The Prodigal Son. The story is a biblical allegory told in the New Testament by Christ, and it is about Christian forgiveness. A father has two sons. One son takes his inheritance early. He basically tells his dad, I want my stuff now. And he takes it and he leaves and he blows it all. And he spends it on wine, women, and song, and he comes back. The other son, who was good and stayed at home and did everything he was told, is upset about his brother returning. And asks his father not to allow him back in, but his father forgives the son and his behavior and says, you are welcome in my house. Not only does he welcome him back, he also throws him a party and kills a fatted calf and all this stuff, and it doesn't make the other son very happy. But the idea is that, with Christian forgiveness, if you ask for it, you'll get it, right? And so Rembrandt, this was a story very close to his heart, despite his many misgivings and failings. This was a guy who was very religious. Hear my dog snoring? You want to see? There she is, snoozing away. So what you're hearing is not some weird bodily noise on my part. It's my dog. This is the fun stuff you get when your professor records things at home, guys. All right, so on the left we see Rembrandt as the prodigal son with his wife Saskia, maybe as a prostitute. And we see him holding this big mug of beer, this flagon of beer. He's wearing this expensive silk shirt. He has this expensive sword on his waist, and he is living the high life, much like Rembrandt was. This was painted when Rembrandt was in his early 30s. I find this painting fascinating because Rembrandt is a master of the self-portrait. He painted around 100 self-portraits throughout his career, and he created about another 100 plus more in prints and drawings. So this is a guy who captured his image throughout his life, very much in the same way that you guys take selfies, as a way of sort of keeping a visual diary, of recording who he is at any given moment in his life. It's not as much vanity as it is a way of creating a visual record in a way. I mean, he's kind of the inventor of the selfie. And here he has painted himself as the prodigal son. Now, he didn't have to do that. He could have hired a model or painted anybody, sort of a generic face or type as the prodigal son. But he chooses to paint himself. This is fascinating to me. Why does he do that? He does that because he understands who he is as a person. Rembrandt knows he is the prodigal son. He is the guy who's going to blow all the money. He's the guy who's going to live too extravagantly and beyond his means. He knows that's who he is. And in the same way that many of us know our own faults and we know our own failings, and we'll even admit to them, and yet we still do the things we shouldn't do. Well, I really should be studying for that test, but my friends are all going out to the bar tonight, or I don't, really, I know I should be, writing this paper, but I'm almost finished with this level on my video game, right? We all know this. We all know what we should be doing, and we all are often aware of our own faults, just like Rembrandt was. He knows he's the prodigal son. And it's that sense of self and that ability to look in on himself with almost a laser-like focus and call himself out on his failings that makes Rembrandt special. That makes him unlike any artist who came before. There's a self-awareness with Rembrandt, both good and bad. Both his good and bad qualities in his art. He portrays that. All right, moving on. Let's move past the blinding of Samson. Rembrandt was one of the great printmakers of his day. This is known as the 100 guilder print, which was how much it sold for, which was very, very expensive for the time. This was something like a month's wages or something. This was a lot of money for a print. And the idea with prints is that they could be relatively cheap. I'm going to have you guys watch a video on Rembrandt's printmaking, so I'm not going to talk about it here. So after you finish this lecture, watch the video in this module. Let's look at two last, but really focusing on one final image by Rembrandt here. These are self-portraits, both made later in life. By the time Rembrandt made these, he was old. He was no longer an incredibly successful artist. He had already lost several of his children and his wife. He had been through several bad love affairs. He had battled with alcoholism. He had lost a lot of his money and his fame, and he was in bad health. And yet, the image on the right especially, I think, is one of my favorite portraits, because here we see Rembrandt obviously old. There is a sense of weariness and sadness on his face as a man who has made a lot of mistakes and suffered a lot of losses. And yet there's a certain pride in the way he stands, in the strength of his stature. And if you look in the background, there are two circles. And these reference, well, a Greek myth and a Renaissance or a proto-Renaissance artist. There's a story of a Greek artist named Apelles, and Apelles was considered to be the greatest artist of all time. His art was so realistic and so convincing that it was claimed that if he painted a picture of a bowl of fruit on a wall, birds would fly into it and break their necks trying to get the fruit. That's how good Apelles was. And there's a story about Apelles that later on was told about Giotto, the artist who was thought to kickstart the Renaissance. And the story is that a king or a ruler comes to Apelles or Giotto, take your pick, one day and says, I want Apelles to paint my portrait. Or the servant he sends says, I want Apelles to paint. I'm sent by my master because the king wants you to paint his portrait. But before you paint it, he wants you to prove that you're the best artist in the world. And to do this, he gave me this piece of paper and this pen, and he wants you to draw a picture of something, and so I can send it back to him. And Apelles is offended by this. He's like, I'm Apelles, dude. You don't need to ask if I'm the best artist there is. Everybody knows it. But you want proof? Fine. He takes out the paper, and then he grabs his pen, and then with one sort of fell swoop, he draws a perfect circle without stopping or starting over or setting the pen down. He takes the paper, rolls it up, and says, all right, there's your proof. Now get out of here. Rembrandt has painted two of those behind him as a sort of acknowledgement of, look, I am a great artist. He understands this. He's aware of this. You see him even holding his tools, his brushes and his palette and his guide stick that artists use to steady their hand. He's aware of his greatness in the same way that he's also aware of his failures and he's aware of what he lacks and he's aware of what he has. And he's honestly 100% truthful about both of those things. Look at the way he's painting. By the end of his life, his brushstrokes have become incredibly experimental. In some ways, this is almost Impressionism before Impressionism. He's using smudges. He's using blending paint together in a way that it looks like paint. It doesn't look like clothes. It doesn't look like hair, but it looks like paint on the canvas. He's emphasizing the materials themselves. He wants to show us his mastery of these materials. He painted, as I said, and drew and produced portraits, self-portraits throughout his entire career. Hundreds. You can go to the Louvre, you can go to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and you can see walls and walls and walls of these. And it's unlike any other artist's body of work, at least up until the modern day, in that you can see, it's almost like looking at his history on social media, like scrolling through his Instagram, looking at these different phases of his life. And you can see in some images, he's portrayed himself as very strong and very powerful, very intelligent, together. In other images, he looks almost out of his mind, maybe drunk. It's very serious in some, very full of doubt and worry in others. Even as an old man, he often portrayed himself as being almost senile. This is a man who's not afraid of the truth, and the truth about himself, no matter how unappealing and embarrassing that might be. And that's what makes Rembrandt great, guys. That's what makes him one of the best.